There have been demonstrations going on for several days in Iran. Who's behind this, and what does it portend for the Middle East and for the rest of the world? Hey, Harley, thank you so much for making yourself available.
Good to see you.
Yes, good to see you. Do enjoy these videos. Normally, we do these with our good friend Alex Craner, but he's not available this month. But hopefully for the next month, so please do subscribe, comment, like. It's Saturday, the 3rd of January at 7:53 as we start this conversation. And Harley, you are the president of the LaRouche organization. And
Yes.
Lyndon LaRouche ran for president 8 times, was really up for promoting the American system of political economy, which I think, well, it seems to me is what Trump wants to do, what Traore is doing, and other countries have also want to do or have been doing. And
Well, it's a form of how you run a sovereign republic, that you have institutions of government which represent the interests of the people, not the special interests of the privileged.
Yes.
And that's what the American Revolution was about. And unfortunately, we keep losing that perspective in the United States. But it's a worthwhile fight.
Yes. And I will be doing a video about this. I've already done one about Ibrahim Traore and the American system of political economy. It's not posted yet, so please do watch out for that and subscribe, comment, like, all that business. And I'll have the links for you, Harley, LaRouche organization, and where people can find your work, including the daily updates that you do via laroucheorganization.com, which are 10-minute videos about what's going on in the world. So what, Harley, is going on in Iran?
Well, this is a continuation of about a 30-year project, which goes back to the triggering of the Khomeini revolution. The Khomeini came to power not because the Shah was so bad. That was the Shah was suppressing changes that had to take place. But there was an Anglo-American and French operation to put Khomeini into power, but not because of love of Islamic fundamentalism, but to break up the potential in the Middle East for a move away from control by the Western powers. And so the natural consequence of the Iranian Revolution was an Iran-Iraq war. And that was a very deadly war. It continued with the Gulf War, the 1990s, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, of course, Afghanistan, and 9/11. So there's been a focus from the Western financial and military and intelligence powers in attacking the potential of the Arab and Muslim nations of forming an alternative system. And this has been a long-term project. It goes back to Bernard Lewis, who's a prominent Oxford historian who is largely responsible for the whole idea of the clash of civilizations. And what you find is that the targeting of Iran is an attempt to not just have an enemy image, but look at the wars in the Middle East, the targeting of Saddam, the targeting of Gaddafi, the targeting of Assad. As a U.S. general reported during the buildup to the Iraq War, the United States had a list of 7 countries they wanted to have regime change. And the last one of those 7 countries is Iran. And so it's not surprising that there's a combination of economic warfare and also war against the establishment, assassinations. And now what's coming out is the economic effects of the sanctions on the Iranian people. So that's the demonstrations are against the inflation, which is making it very, very hard for the people of Iran to sit quietly and accept the collapse of their country. So that's, in a sense, the project of regime change is well underway in Iran. And whenever there's a regime change, you have to look for such organizations as the Agency of International Development, the USAID, the International Republican Institute, MI6, CIA, and so on.
Bloody hell, Hardy. That's just incredible. What's incredible is just the knowledge that you have to connect all these things together. I mean, you boggled my mind right at the beginning. I remember when Khomeini flew from Paris, he was exiled in Paris in 1979 to Iran. And it never occurred to me, of course, I was much younger then, that somehow he was owned or cultivated or captured by the West.
Well, when he flew, Alexander Haig, who was an aide to Ronald Reagan, told a NATO official told the Iranian army to stay in the barracks and not to interfere with Khomeini's arrival. And that was one indication of the U.S. support for that revolution. Now, he was in Paris.
One second, Holly. Didn't that go wrong because then Iran turned against the West?
Well, of course, because look at the history of Iran, the modern history goes to 52, 53, the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Mossadegh. And who did that? It was British Petroleum and the CIA. So they brought the Shah in. And that was a prominent regime change, which is known to everyone in Iran. So even people who don't like the Ayatollahs recognize that modern Iranian history was shaped by the overthrow of the democratically elected government, which was really committed to moving Iran into the modern history. Now, the Shah, because of his connections with the West, did industrialize the country and brought certain improvements, but he was resistant to have a social revolution that would follow it through. And so the gap between the peasantry and the poor and the privileged class was what was used to create the Khomeini revolution. But you're absolutely right. Khomeini was protected in Paris, and his videos were smuggled into whatever networks could show them in Iran. Now, then you come into the more recent period after the Iran-Iraq War. You had Kuwait, which has a long history of Anglo-American operations, launched an attack on Iraq. They were doing the slant oil drilling, taking Iraqi oil. And when Saddam complained to the United States, the U.S. said, well, we're not involved in these inter-Arab affairs, in a sense giving him a go-ahead to invade Kuwait. And once that happened, at first, the United States didn't want to get involved. So Margaret Thatcher flew to Washington, met with George H.W. Bush, and she later reported, I had to stiffen his spine to get the U.S. to launch Desert Shield and the attack on Iraq. And then you had in the 90s, Clinton and the sanctions that killed 500,000 Iraqi children that Madeleine Albright praised by saying it was necessary in order to get rid of Saddam. And then you had Blair and Richard Dearlove cook up this phony weapons of mass destruction line on Saddam, which was part of the reaction to 9/11. Iraq had nothing to do with al-Qaeda and the attack on the Twin Towers. So you look over this period of time and you see the British constantly manipulating U.S. intelligence, and U.S. intelligence willingly gobbling up what they were given, including then in 2011, the operation against Gaddafi. And who was leading that? Well, Cameron, Sarkozy, and as Obama said, the U.S. was leading from behind. The Syria situation, the so-called civil war, Operation Timber Sycamore, which was a CIA MI6 operation to create an opposition inside Syria. And so time after time, and then most recently, the attacks on the Iranian nuclear program. Iran had this agreement, which was brokered internationally, that they would not build nuclear weapons. They have a fatwa from the Ayatollah against nuclear weapons. And yet the line was they're days or weeks away from having nuclear weapons. And so just in the beginning of the Trump administration, Netanyahu convinced the U.S. to join Israel in supposedly destroying Iran's nuclear program. So it's been a long time operation on financial, on diplomatic, on sanctions, military assault, and so on. And now it's coming to a head again. And precisely after Netanyahu went to Washington or to Mar-a-Lago to convince Trump that the U.S. had to be prepared once again to support Israeli attack on Iran. So history repeats itself because it doesn't stop.
No, but okay. So who's behind this? These demonstrations? Is it really purely organic, grassroots, because the people have been so suppressed and they're suffering so much because of the sanctions? And or is it being stirred by foreign forces? Because I can see how the British would benefit because it will weaken BRICS. but also how Israel would benefit. And then if Israel benefits, then the British benefit.
Well, the Mossad had a working relationship with the Shah's secret police that was really quite close. And the Israelis have people in Iran. They have continued to maintain their networks. But as you point out, when people are desperate, when it's hard to put food on the table, when there's limited hope for the future, these kinds of operations can succeed. Regime change operations can't succeed in a country where people are happy. And I think that's what they have concluded is the problem with doing something against Xi Jinping in China or against Putin in Russia. They need military if they want to break that up. But in countries that are poorer, it's easier to have a regime change that will work. And it includes psychological warfare. It includes hybrid warfare of all sorts. The U.S. government has all these media personalities that are trained to go into these countries who speak the language. I mean, this is what Radio Free Europe used to be. You find the dissidents and you feed them as much as you can information and intelligence and money and know-how, how to set up a clandestine operation. And there's a book, I can't remember the author, but it's called Color Revolutions. It's about how you organize a discontented population to go against a seemingly powerful authoritarian state. And that's what we've seen in Iran since 1953.
Okay, and is this a color revolution, do you think?
Well, it would be if it continues. And the intent is to remove the existing government, which is an opposition to the continued looting of countries in the Middle East. I mean, what's starting to happen is in the Muslim world, the governments are involved in an attempt to modernize and to make themselves resistant to this kind of operation by opening their society, including in Saudi Arabia a little bit. That's what Mohammed bin Salman's doing. So the threat is that if these governments are allowed to form alternative arrangements, for example, the Saudis and the Iranians, who were at each other's throats for a long time, a deal brokered by the Chinese brought a rapprochement just last year. And that threatens it's not just oil, it's also ports and transportation and the overall control that goes into geopolitics that are threatened if you have a country like Saudi Arabia, which is a Sunni nation predominantly, and the Shia Muslims of Iran, if they form an alliance, and they were both moving into the BRICS, the alternative potential to the International Monetary Fund system, then you have a real threat, because it's not just that these countries are very wealthy, but that they're looking to the future. The reason the Russians are able to have some success with Saudi Arabia is the development of nuclear power in Saudi Arabia. The Chinese, because of the Belt and Road Initiative, are extremely influential now in the Middle East. And this is a threat to the project that goes back to the Arab Bureau in Cairo, that at the end of World War I was carving up the Middle East. And so if you understand these things from the broad historic arc, it's clear what's going on. And it takes time for these operations to work. But if you continue to impose an impoverishment and a lack of hope for the future, you can, especially with young people, create the basis for a color revolution. And that's what we're seeing now, I think, in Iran.
Right. Okay. So it could be developing into a color revolution, because I imagine even if it started off organically, then we're going to get hostile elements moving in order to capitalize on that situation, because what Israel doesn't want, what the City of London doesn't want, is a strong, sovereign, self-sufficient Iranian state.
Well, and look at what they've done. They targeted all the nuclear physicists in the country. They assassinated half a dozen of the leading scientists, the political leaders, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They're under sanctions. They've done everything they could to weaken the power of the state. And the fact that it's still in power is an indication that it's not going to be an easy fight. But that's why it's so important that Netanyahu is using what was drafted originally by the Wolfowitz gang, the so-called breakaway ally scenario, which is that Israel takes the leadership in launching a war, which it can't succeed on its own, but then calls on the United States to come in and bail it out. This was in the 90s. It was drafted as a strategy which was given to Netanyahu. So Netanyahu knows there are people in the U.S. intelligence community that are waiting for a call from Israel that we're set to go, but we're going to need help. And they're not just talking about refueling bombers on their routes, but they're talking about protection from incoming missiles and the repercussions financially of Israel going into an all-out war on top of their war on the Palestinians in Gaza. They need financial aid. They can't survive a war with Iran.
Yep.
And Iran has a stronger military than most people know. And so this is heading toward a crescendo. And I'm just afraid there are too many of these war hawks in the United States controlled by the Zionist lobby that are willing to do whatever Netanyahu demands.
And what Netanyahu has been demanding of late of Trump is that, because it used to be, Iran's nuclear industry, its nuclear weapons that it's developing according to Israel are a threat. It's now saying, no, its ballistic missiles are a threat, right? So they've lowered the threat, the threshold for the threat.
And also unspoken is the whole question of the BRICS, the alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is growing and now includes Iran and Egypt and several other Middle Eastern countries, that, including possibly the United Arab Emirates, that instead of using their resources to build Disneylands in the middle of the desert, maybe they're going to start investing in African countries. And we see, besides China and Russia, we see some interest in the Arab world in helping the African countries develop as a breakaway from the control of the International Monetary Fund. So this is extremely unsettling to people who are betting the house that you can contain these countries and divide them against each other.
Yeah, and thus, and the IMF acting as a proxy for the City of London and the financialists, the international financial cartel.
Well, it's Wall Street and the City of London together have created this structural adjustment program system where you indebt a country by stealing its raw materials, you loan it some money, you get it into debt, and then you send in the economic hitmen. John Perkins wrote a beautiful, it's an accurate book called Economic Hitmen on how the IMF comes in and imposes austerity, and if the governments don't go along with it, they're cut off financially and eventually overthrown. And it's happened repeatedly. This was the whole policy of the so-called banana republics in Central America, because the United Fruit Company was at the center of that. And the United Fruit Company included CIA and organized crime that were running drugs from these countries and using the drug money to fund insurgencies against countries like Nicaragua that didn't go along with it.
Okay. And then I want to go back to the ballistic missiles and Netanyahu's lobbying of Trump and what you said earlier about how Israel needs the United States to come in on its attack on Iran because Israel doesn't have the money and doesn't have the weaponry necessary to defeat Iran. Trump posted something saying, if the Iranians carry on shooting civilians, then we're going to get involved. And, in his brusque, clumsy manner. But Trump says a lot. He says a hell of a lot and then does something differently. And then the other thing that Trump has done is that the U.S. Navy ships that were in the Eastern Mediterranean are no longer there. He's removed them to the Caribbean. So how do you think Trump's going to respond to all of this?
Well, I think there's a big problem for Trump because he's got people like Hegseth and Marco Rubio who want regime change in Venezuela. And some of it has to do with their connections to the networks that are involved in drug trafficking. Supposedly they're going to stop drug trafficking by shooting these small boats. The drug trafficking from Latin America and Central America is largely done through money laundering through the offshore banks. And if Trump wants to do something about drugs, he ought to go after the offshore banks. But he's not. He's trapped by his legitimate concern with the drug problem in the United States. At the same time, when you look at the Iran situation, the Zionist lobby is extremely powerful in the United States, but they've been losing their ground because of the genocide in Gaza. Young Americans are turning against the American support for Netanyahu, including in the Republican Party. This was the whole issue around the Charlie Kirk assassination, that the young conservatives were starting to say to Trump, look, America first, why are we spending money in Israel when we don't have money for natural disasters in the United States, for infrastructure, for education, healthcare? And so you have a blowback against Israel. And so Netanyahu is terrified. The Jerusalem Post has had editorials about the concern of the loss of the influence of the Zionist lobby in the United States and the weakening of the charges of anti-Semitism because it's been overused. So Netanyahu has to present a drastic picture of Iran preparing to attack and destroy Israel. Now, in the meantime, for self-defense reasons, Iran has developed a very significant ballistic missile program. And we saw during the last series of exchanges that some of the Iranian missiles did get through the Iron Dome. And so this is a legitimate threat to Israel. The economy in Israel is stretched thin. A lot of people are leaving. The money that goes into the war is essentially not trickling down to the population. And then on top of that, you have these corruption charges against Netanyahu and his cronies, that they're on a payroll, or they're linked to Qatar, funds coming in that Israel is secretly involved in getting funding from the United Arab Emirates. So it's a big mess in Israel. Now, for Netanyahu, the solution is the old enemy image. You have an enemy image, a picture of bloodthirsty Muslim fanatics who are going to come in and slit the throat of everyone in Israel. Of course, what Hamas did on October 7th played into that. Netanyahu's also terrified that there'll be an honest investigation into why Israel was unprepared on October 7th. So he's got all kinds of pressures, but he's a psychotic. His whole life is committed to the Greater Israel Project, which it goes back to the Jabotinsky revisionist movement, which said Israel is from the Nile to the Tigris-Euphrates. And that's why Israel is now involved in Syria, in Lebanon. And they're prepared to go to war with anyone in that area for that project. And there's an element of messianic belief in it, that this was God's promise to the Jewish people. But there's also the economic reality of getting money from the West to build these new settlements. So it's the worst of all possible confluence of events. And I don't think Trump is up to it. I think he put a lot of effort with Witkoff into getting the ceasefire in Gaza. That's not working very well. He's now committed the United States to regime change in Venezuela. And he's also trapped by the Europeans, basically saying the U.S. will lose Ukraine if they don't support us. So his whole brand of being for peace is threatened by the reality of the operations being run by the pro-war factions in the United States and outside, including from the United Kingdom especially.
I suppose it's really, really challenging for someone to continue standing for peace when they're surrounded by those that would instigate war.
And are desperate because the financial system is literally on weak ground right now. The debt problems of countries, including the United States, are out of control. The way out of it is industrial reinvestment and expansion of trade. But they're sanctioning a lot of potential trade partners. And meanwhile, France, Germany, the European Union, these countries are most of them in a fairly significant economic crisis of their own. Trade between the United States and the EU countries is shrinking. And it's not just because of sanctions, it's because there's not the desire for these new trade agreements to take place. And in the meantime, China is in the forefront of replacing the industrial power of the United States, and it's having an effect on countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Algeria, Nigeria. These are countries that are now being brought into a new potential financial system, which could go outside of the dollar. Now, this is terrifying people in Wall Street and London, because as long as the dollar was the reserve currency, and even though it's not the official reserve currency, it functions that way. If you want to even out a balance of trade deficit, you have to do it in dollars. And countries have to use their own currencies that are valued not at the real value, but at the value the City of London attributes to them. So they get screwed because of the debt, and they get screwed because of the parity relations. And they don't want that anymore. They're starting to break with that. And that's the extra added pressure. And the fact that trade with China is growing so rapidly for much of the world. And the Japanese, they're trying to bring the Japanese into the Western system, and the Japanese are looking at it, and they're still in with the West, but they're realizing there's not a good future there. So the whole situation is moving very rapidly away from a dollar-controlled empire based in the City of London.
Yes, and when they're getting more and more desperate, when currencies collapse, we have war breaking out, which is something you and I covered in an earlier conversation we had about Ukraine and Europe and the implications of that. Plus, also I did a conversation with Ian Burlingame about the financial pressures resulting in war in Ukraine. And what was great is it covered different aspects, those conversations, looking at it from different angles. And then Harley, you mentioned earlier about Venezuela. We need to finish up soon. You mentioned earlier about Venezuela and the drugs, and there's a video that I recorded with Blaine Holt and Ian Burlingame and they suggested that the US fleet in the Caribbean is collecting intelligence on all these movements of money. Where do the drug cartels' money flow, through which banks? And
well, one would hope that's true.
I hope that's true, right? But
the fact is, they know a lot of that. Look, Chase Manhattan, for example, has paid billions of dollars in fines. Deutsche Bank has been repeatedly fined for their money laundering. The Grand Cayman Islands is known as a money laundering center. They have the intelligence. They don't have the desire, because you may have honest people in the anti-drug forces in these governments, but they've constantly been turned away. And they've been told to turn a blind eye because this is part of the intelligence operation. There's new information, for example, coming out on Iran-Contra from the 1980s, where the U.S. was allowing Central American drugs to be sold in American cities to provide funds to provide arms for the Contras, and also involved in arms sales to Israel that Israel was providing to Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. And when there was an attempt to shut this down, it was overturned. They wouldn't shut it down. And ultimately, it's interesting. This involved Jeffrey Epstein, because he had a company that bought the planes from Southern Air Transport that were being investigated for bringing the drugs to the United States from Central America. And that airline was put into bankruptcy 2 days before the Justice Department filed their case. So there's protection for these operations. So it would be nice to believe that they're really looking into the drug trafficking, but who are they? They're targeting these the drug runners, the small guys, when we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars annually churning through these operations. So I think that that's a cover story.
Well, what they said is that these small-time drug dealers or whatever, they get on the phone to their protectors, and they get on the phone their protectors, and that's been tracked. And this is a question that you will get a chance to put to Blaine Holt, because you and I are working at a time when you and retired General Blaine Holt, who was second in command of the US contingent to NATO at one point, because you both agreed to have a conversation together, that you can ask him when that happens. So I'm going to say to people, please do subscribe and comment and like in this video, and make sure you watch all my other videos where we dig deep into what is really going on in the world. Harley, anything you want to say before we finish up?
Well, I think that the attitude of the American people is that they don't want to have a war with Venezuela. They don't understand it. And Trump is being told he's got to sell it and sell it on this question of drugs. But it also includes the whole question of oil, because the price of oil is dropping, and that's aimed at Russia. That's another point that was made in the Daily Telegraph article I mentioned earlier, that Russia's in trouble because oil is now heading below $60 a barrel. But then there's also the element of the U.S. Southern Command trying to whip up hysteria over Chinese involvement in Latin America. And the Chinese just did a deal in Peru, and they're working on a deal with their fellow BRICS member, Brazil, to have a railroad that crosses the continent from connecting the Pacific and the Atlantic. This is something that's been a dream of people from Latin America for years. It's the same kind of dream people have in Africa. Why is it that the transportation in these countries goes from the mines to the ports to ship wealth out, but there's no interconnection? You can't get across, for example, the Amazon because there's no transportation system. The Chinese are proposing to work that out, and that's what they're trying to stop. China's involvement or one of the things they're trying to stop, China's involvement in South America.
Oh my gosh, gets more and more baffling and more complex. And Harley, what I acknowledge you for is just your incredible wealth and breadth and depth of knowledge. Like how you draw upon all these different strands with barely a stutter. It's quite remarkable.
Well, what Lyndon LaRouche built was an intelligence operation called Executive Intelligence Review, which various people have described as the best private intelligence in the world. Now, I'm a little prejudiced because I've worked with them since its creation, but I think we've proven our accuracy time and again, and people who doubted us have had to come around and say, well, you were right. So I would urge people to look at the Executive Intelligence Review LaRouche Pub website and see what we've been doing over the years. And we have something now called the LaRouche Legacy Foundation, where we're compiling the volumes of work that was done by LaRouche personally that inspired people like me and my colleagues to dig in and go beyond the headlines and figure out what's really happening and build up a whole network. And that's what we're talking about. This is not just my personal knowledge. It's my being plugged into a network that's been doing this for 50 years.
That's fabulous. Fabulous, Harley. And I should link to the LaRouche organization in the description below. And also I recommend people go check out your daily updates that you do via LaRoucheorganization.com, 10, 12 minutes, letting people know what's going on in the world. And also, please, if you're in the UK, it's a criminal offense to pay any local or central government tax, directly or indirectly, because it violates the International Criminal Court Act and the Terrorism Act, and you can legally, lawfully, peacefully withhold your taxes. Go to notaxforwar.com. Please subscribe, comment, like, and I look forward to speaking to you all again.
See you soon.